Thank you, Emma, and thank you, everyone, for good evening. Thank you for turning up. Hello, and thank you. Just starting. And as usual, thank you for the very exaggerated introduction. Let's see what we can make of this evening. I have to ask in advance for your patience at my audacity to come here and say things about art in this place. But I hope I will be able to tell you about a few things you may not hear elsewhere about art and these particular aspects of history of science. This talk could have been titled just as well, Wayfinding as a Form of Art. So my plan tonight is to speak a little about art in general first, and then find my way to the specifics of navigation in general, and finally of navigation in the Indian Ocean. The time frame of the nautical practices I will describe is on the documents, on the preserved manuscripts, in the 16th century, more or less. But in practice, it reaches at least as far as, or as close to us as the early 20th century. This means that there are the documents that are at the basis of my talk and my research at this moment are documents that belong to mostly to the 16th century and a little later sometimes. But the nautical practices that they talk about have been preserved, and fragments of them still to our days, and in a good quantity to the early 20th century they are traceable. This is why, because of this documentary time frame, if you will, this is why I have used an early modern nautical chart for the poster of the lecture. More precisely, this Portuguese chart, 1510, and this shows that a little history is in order before we begin. But let me, so this is a very particular map. A nautical chart. It was a technical document, and I'm sorry that the resolution didn't came out well here. But you can see this is a map in 1510. The Portuguese had about 12 years earlier turned around this cape, and very systematically there had been exploration down the coast, down the west coast of Africa over decades, an accumulation of information until they rounded the Cape, and they knew through informers that there was a lot of trade here and maritime routes to India and to some islands here where they were aiming at to find spices to trade in Europe. So what you can see in this map how this is a very technical document in that it is showing you only what they had directly first-hand knowledge of, or good references that they felt they could rely on. And then, for instance, they have this here, but they didn't draw the rest of India or elsewhere here. This would come in later charts. And well, I'll tell you a bit more about the context. And of course, from a graphical, artistic point of view, I encourage you to have a look at this at some point, these beautiful wind roses. Each one has 32 rhombs, and there are 32 of them. It's a very fascinating combination of a technical document and a work of art, as was so common. So it is partly because of this extraordinary event in the 16th century, the development by the Portuguese and Spanish kingdoms of this oceanic navigation that I am using this time frame here. at the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th century, these two kingdoms, Portugal and Spain, developed not only techniques, nautical techniques to sail for long periods of time far from land, which was a very different thing from navigation in the Mediterranean, where it's hard to get out of sight of land, when people are sailing. But also, they not only developed these techniques, but there was an imperial administrative machinery behind this that made for a very systematic, careful, and controlled and rigorous collection of information and accumulation of information. And then people were traveling and they had clear instructions as to what they had to record when they were traveling. And then as soon as they arrived, these pilots had to be briefed, had to be debriefed at the offices of the Casa de la Contratación in Sevilla or in Lisbon, the equivalent institutions, Armazéns de Guinée. So they have to go there and tell what they had seen, show what all the data that they had recorded. And this, continuing decade after decade, made for the powerful nautical enterprises that sustained these empires for some time. And of course, needless to say, so this was the first time in history. I don't like, I'm very much, I trained as a classicist first. So for me, it's very hard to say, oh, this is new in history. Because so often you think, oh, this is very new, and then nihil novum sub sole, said Solomon, nothing new under the sun. And it was there, when we see things horrible happening in politics, for instance, you just go to imperial Rome and you have it all. The parties, everything was there. So it's hard for me to say this was new in history. But this is one of the cases where you can say something was new in history. And the new thing was that for the first time, significant groups of people were traveling oceanic distances regularly and even incrementally, establishing regular trade on a planetary scale. There had been big travels like solitary enterprises and epic navigation, but establishing routes and going on and making, as it were, these big roads, these waterways, from Europe to India or from Europe to Brazil and North America. This was very new. And needless to say, we are still living under the reverberations of these feats. And unfortunately also of the outrages that followed in what we nicely are used to calling colonization. But I won't digress on that direction. So this is our time frame, and our geographic frame will be more specific. Approximately, in a way, I will be speaking of what happened in this area, the northern part of the Indian Ocean. Sometimes this is called the Arabian Sea. But actually the techniques of navigation that I'm going to be speaking about are common to peoples from here, the east coast of Africa, all the way to the Pacific. So even to this day, Polynesian sailors, and this is well documented and has been even at some point a favorite topic of some anthropologists, the techniques of navigation based on stars used by Polynesian sailors are similar in the basics to techniques that were used in the Western Indian Ocean. But today, closer to my own research, I will be speaking of techniques that are documented mostly in Arabic documents of the late 15th century and early 16th. So now I will try to make a case for considering navigation and art. And then we need to speak a bit about how is it that I will be using this term of art. Art, arguing from the etymological point of view, is fundamentally joinery. And this, I say this based on the history of the word. And if this looks like Greek to you, it's because it's Greek. So you have aro. So these are verbs. These are Greek verbs, ararisko, and then you have related words. The basic root is these two ar consonants, and then you have several derivatives. Arthron, a joint, like a joint of the body, and harmos. It could be like Latin armus, a joint, a shoulder. Harmonia, very popular. All related to this basic idea of joining together two parts. Hartao, same. And then ars artis. So it can be defined by, this is straight from a Latin dictionary, a good Latin dictionary, it's like 4 kilos. You know, the quality of classical languages dictionaries is measured by the kilos. So this is a good dictionary, 3 or 4 kilos. The craft of fitting things. And related words are an artifex, which is an artisan or a craftsman, and artificium, so when also artificial things, right? So we could say art, the skill in joining something. And further, if we work with this definition, the skill of in joining something, the craft of fitting things, we can see playing a bit with this and using Greek terms that are familiar and that are used usually when discussing history of art and so on. Let's change this word craft for techne. It's one of the meanings, very important meanings of this word, like at the origin of our word technique or technology, yes? So the techne, the craft of fitting things, and skill, one of the important meanings of this word Sophia. Sophia is often translated as wisdom, but that's a bit of a lazy translation. Originally, it had a lot to do with practical know-how. And skill is actually a very good translation for it. Of course, this is always an important caveat about developing this kind of argument is that we're taking as it were a snapshot of a language that has a history of 3,000 years or something like that. But still, I think it's very helpful to show us the different what is contained in the words that we use every day, right? And to help us look into them and what is in them. And then one important thing here is that these two words, techne and Sophia, this craft and skill or craft and wisdom, they were based on logos, a ratio, a proportion. It also means a word, but the original meaning of logos has to do with number, with geometry, more than grammar. So this, when we speak of this very basic idea at the root of art, we find number, measure, proportion. But of course, as I said, preaching to the choir here because, you know, with all those polyhedra lying around. And so the word art, over its very long history, alternated, or rather danced, between these two semantic extremes. Yes, the art if we're looking at it in this way, we can see that contains the idea of a product, the harmony, yes, what you are making when you do this joint, when you do this fitting, and it also contains the know-how, the rule, the method, and that would be the Sophia. That would correspond to that Sophia. So the word art, over its long history, had this alternation, yes? Sometimes the emphasis was more on the product, and sometimes more on the way of doing things. Until our times, when outside exceptional places like this school, it has become a rather abused word, empty, wishy-washy. And this explains to a certain extent the perceived need for neologisms like technoscience used by sensitive historians who no longer find in the word art the meaning that it had in previous centuries. So you start studying the history of art, and for instance, from a more from the point of view of an artist, you find, well, it's not quite. What I see now in museums is not quite what was obviously done or discussed. And then people start saying, well, we need to speak about craft, and the same in history of science. The same happens, you know. People in history of science start studying the story of the history of the discipline. They realize, well, this word doesn't quite cut it. The reality was obviously different. It's not what we are used to calling like that nowadays. And then you have to come up with some solutions, and you speak of technoscience, or you have to do long sentences specifying what you mean. Words can be very fickle that way. I thought it would be helpful and necessary to refresh then these few principles about the meaning of art as we know it, in order to develop more transparently my argument now. And so let us see now what was the practice of those early modern navigators, and if it is somehow akin to what I have sketched here as art. And let us go back to our chart to delimit geographically the scope of my reflections. So we can see here very obviously the Red Sea. It's very obviously red. And it goes down here of the east coast of Africa, west coast of India mostly, which traded very intensely with, well, it traded with everyone for millennia. But in these times, the Portuguese made several fortifications there. And then here, roughly, you can see this area. There was Malacca there in the Strait of Malacca. It was an important location also. Now, some people call, in these kind of studies, they speak of the Indo-Pacific or the extended Indian Ocean, going as far as Japan also, or at least the South China Sea. Because historically, they were so tightly knit, you know, the cultural relations there, it's very remarkable. In fact, some people have observed that the Indian Ocean may be called rightly the most traffic-intensive body of water in the history of mankind. We cannot fathom simply the beginning of navigation on the coasts of the Indian Ocean, but the archaeological records have kept steadily pushing the earliest dates back. And you find, you know, Chinese pottery in very distant places, or wares coming from Arabia, many, and also linguistically. So there's a lot of evidence for very, very long and steady movement of trade and people in this expansion of water. I am going to speak then in particular about the nautical techniques used in this area, about this late 15th century, as I mentioned. And then let us try to picture the situation of a pilot in the ocean for a moment. And let us begin, like traditional accounts of creation do, in the evening, under the night sky. But we need to keep in mind that when we say the night sky, we do not mean this. Well, sorry, this is again the same area I was speaking about. And then if we, going back to the night of the sailor, we don't mean this, right? This is an impoverished version of the night that we are used to in our modern cities. So we can see one or two little points, bright dots, yes? But rather, we should remember that it was something, you know, this still getting a bit closer, but still far from what it is. This is still poor, but you can start seeing some constellations, right? So this is, what is this? The plow, yes, Ursa Major, right? Yes, and then this would be Polaris. Yes, so Polaris is here, and you can see a few other things. So this is Ursa Minor. But actually the actual situation might have looked a bit more like this. Yeah, I should have chosen the same part of the sky here, but I'm sorry, I missed that. Well, I hope you have had that experience, and if not, try to look for one good location for that. It's really impressive, and then it's even more impressive than historically if we think, well, this was all the time. Yes, if every night you would see something like this, it gives astronomy and this kind of techniques a different meaning. Nowadays we have to look for what they call dark sky areas to be able to see something similar. There are some dark sky areas in the UK. The problem here is, you know, the atmosphere. Sometimes it's not very helpful. But then in those blessed TV-free nights that people had in earlier centuries, every night was an opportunity for an encounter with the regularity of the heavenly bodies. And what did they see? And what can still be seen if we have the opportunity? So going back to the constellations we had earlier, yes, if we, as the hours of the night pass, pay attention, look at this. Again, we have the plow here, right? And if you prolong these two, this is Polaris, yes? And this is the head of Ursa Minor, the end of that. So look at what happens when the hours pass. They are turning. Everything is turning, right? Except Polaris. Yes, and if you keep watching, you understand that there is a pattern, that there are some invisible lines. We don't see them, but they are obviously there, yes? And so this is what we call an equator, yes? So you have a sphere turning, you've identified an axis, that would be Polaris. So you see, and everything is turning there, so when you realize you're inside a sphere like this, well, the middle line, that's your celestial equator. Yes, divides the sphere. And then if you observe more and you carry on, just I won't go into so much astronomical detail now, but you take my word for it, then you realize that it's even more complex and that there is like a big grid of meridians and parallels that can be drawn. Yes? And this all goes down to the observation. And then the night keeps passing, and they keep turning, and the morning is coming. And then the sun is coming up. And then the sun is up. And with the movement of the sun, a new grid is drawn, which does not quite correspond to the night grid, but combines with the other, and we're not going into these details now. But the visual summary of these movements and the lines that can be inferred in this way is what we know as an armillary sphere. So you may have seen similar contraptions. I wonder if you build some of those here. That would be very nice if you started constructing armillary spheres in this school. Because it's a sort of polyhedron. Well, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say that. But in any case, these are the armillary spheres, so this is an Arab, but the idea is the same. You see, it's usually a pedagogical, a teaching device used to show to people what these movements are. And here's a Chinese example. And very interestingly, in the coat of arms of Portugal, you have an armillary sphere, because they obviously paid a lot of attention to that, to the armillary sphere. And it's a summary of these celestial movements. It's a very ancient object. There are very old examples of that, and in different cultures too. In the extended Indian Ocean in particular, they gave the stars an additional usage to divide all the circle of the horizon, the 360 degrees that surround us everywhere, to draw the directions of the compass. So what I mean is this: in the Indian Ocean, they chose 15 stars around the horizon, which marked by their settings and risings the directions of the compass. And they ended with what is called a celestial compass. And this is an Arabic example, marking the 32 rhombs or nautical directions. So what this means is, let's say if this is my north, yes, and things are turning like this, I can see that the same star is rising there, northeast, or the same star is rising northwest. What is this? Southeast. Southeast, and then it would go like this and set southwest, right? And then this same star would be used to mark these two rhombs, yes, southeast and southwest. And the same, so they, of course, you just 4 directions or 8 directions is not enough. Yes, if you want to determine your course when you're sailing. Yes, you need a bit more accuracy. And this is how you come to 32, or partly how. There is a lot, there's some basic mathematics involved there probably. But in any case, many cultures have used this system of 32 divisions of the horizon, of the azimuth, you know, the directions. And then, so taking stock of these astronomical bearings, the pilots were able to determine their position, or at least their latitude, with great accuracy. And they were able to set their direction, and all this by the observation of the heavens, by establishing a relation, that is, a connection between their situation, their course, and the movements above. With a little observation, we can appreciate that all this knowledge of the stars and the sophisticated use they made of their combinations is based on one of the 2 common elements of every craft, that is, the rule of number, what I referred to above using the Greek word logos, this art knowledge. In one of Plato's dialogues, the Epinomis, it is explicitly said that humankind learns number from the observation of the heavenly bodies. So he ties mathematics directly, or arithmetic at least directly, to the observation of the stars. Because obviously the phenomena on the ground are not so regular, and this is one of the marvels, you know, from ancient times of the movement of the celestial bodies. They are very regular, yes. Down here on Earth, atmosphere again, you know, in the sublunary world, things can get complicated. yes, with rain, storms, floods, etc. And people, most of all. But if you look at the stars, it's a lovely regularity. It's very reassuring, yes. But sometimes a comet appears, and this was very problematic, especially from the astrological point of view. But you see, even from the creation of the world in medieval times to the making of astronomical models, to the creation of every work of art, there is a direct, uninterrupted line of knowledge. The concept of science in its unadulterated plenary sense. And this applies to architecture, to music, to drawing, and once again, of course, I am talking of things you know well and you know concretely. But the transparent relation between number, between the modules of design, and the contemplation of the night sky bears emphasizing. So you see, well, I'm cheekily borrowing even from the school's website there, but you can see of course, you know well this image of God as a geometer, and there in the middle is an astronomer at work, an astronomer, if you will, at work, and then an application of geometry in the arts. And maybe, you know, there is this partly a reason why, as some people have observed, it is remarkable that we call stars both the geometric diagrams that we can see there and the actual stars in the sky. So there's food for thought there in the stars. But I would like to mention the other level on which they were establishing connections. Yeah, so the first level is these pilots were establishing connections between their traveling and the sky. Yes, the movements of the heavenly bodies. The knowledge of the sky, though, has its subtleties too, as is shown by the existence of the complementary studies of astronomy and astrology, or cosmography and cosmology, and even the curious existence of the two overlapping and partly interchangeable terms, heaven and sky. This other level relates symbolically to the recognition of patterns, the asterisms or constellations, in contrast to the knowledge of the isolated stars. This would be what we see as a joining of the dots of the stars. This example gives us an idea, although rather too static and flat, of the knowledge that the Indian Ocean pilots carried with them. In reality, it was not just as simple as joining dots. And there is a marvelous passage in the great classic of Arabic navigation, Ahmad ibn Majid's commentaries to the principles and foundations of maritime science, late 15th century, where he puts it this way. The discerning pilot finds his way through the expanse and the compact of the heavenly spheres, advances to the ultimate degree, and thus pictures the sciences in his heart, and comprehends the turning and dimensions of the spheres through the stars as they rise and set. The crucial expression here is this picturing the sciences in his heart. First, in the original, the word I have translated as picturing is related to suwar, the forms, in a Platonic sense, of the archetypes. It was a customary name for the constellations. But it's very interesting that this term suwar is usually used for 3D objects, not just for something flat, bidimensional. And this is when we saw the earlier slide, I said this picture of the constellations is a bit flat, because actually when you see at the night sky, there is a very subtle appreciation of the depth of the sky. It's not very evident at first sight, but if you keep looking, there is something. And people who can recognize the stars, experienced navigators, for instance, who know this, they are able to recognize a single star in a part of the sky at a given moment of the year, or just by two little stars that they see between the clouds, they can tell a whole thing, the whole situation. Not just because they know, the joining of the dots. It's also because there's more to it. There are the colors also. There are subtle differences in the colors of stars, and some stars are famously, characteristically, of one color or another. So this same word related to the forms and the archetypes, suwar, is also directly related to one of the names of God in Islam, al-musawwir, the fashioner, the giver of forms. And it is a direct cognate of the Hebrew root yetzirah, making or crafting. And there is a very famous medieval book, Sefer Yetzirah, about creating the universe with words and with language. So this suwar, this word has to do with giving shape, particularly in this three-dimensional way, as I was saying. So when he says picturing the sciences in the heart, is all this knowledge about the stars, it's as if it is embodied more than just, I see it there, like a picture, maybe a bit more concretely. Second, in the original and in common with other ancient languages, the word for heart does not refer, or not solely, to this marvelous blood pump we have beating here, but primarily to the spiritual and psychic center of our life, where, between quotation marks, where our life in lowercase meets our life in uppercase. And Ibn Majid is saying, through this practice of astronomical navigation by night, the accomplished pilot will embody through his heart those celestial forms, and he will know directly the circular course of the spheres. Yes, and this is a traditional picture of the spheres in medieval times. This is an Arabic, but very close, similar imagery in the West, where you can see the different spheres of the planets, and around the circle also, you have the 12 zodiacal signs, and you have a division of the transit of the moon in 28 divisions, called the lunar mansions, the manazil. And these were also used, so for sailors, you see, this is very interesting of these techniques and very characteristic. For if you are using the stars a lot to navigate in situations that would normally mean be life or death situations. If you go the wrong direction, if you crash, you can crash into some rocks or shoals. So when you do that, the division of the zodiac in 12 parts is a bit too large. One zodiacal sign. So and we have to remember, and here this is why all astrologers were also always astronomers. They had to know what was happening around. So right now, how many zodiacal signs are on the sky right now? Anyone? 6. It has to be 6 because it's 180 degrees. You have 12 signs. 360, all the circle, 12 divided by 12, divided by, you have parts of 30 degrees, yes? So each zodiacal sign is 30 degrees of the sky, and that moves slowly, so let's say Aries is there, and then it keeps moving, and then, then the next sign, it will take like 3 hours, I think, to appear there. So this division of 12 of the sky is a bit slow for very practical purposes. So there is an alternative division. And it is a division that was used, well, still is used actually in India a lot, and the Arabs at some point borrowed this knowledge of this doctrine of the lunar mansions, as they were called, or the lunar stations. And it is a division of the same circle in 28 parts. And of course, when you have this a lot smaller division, then every hour or so, there is a new mansion coming up. And then this could be used to measure time by night. Yes? And then combined knowledge of the constellations would help identify your location, your latitude, basically. The most important thing in this kind of early medieval and early modern navigation was to determine your latitude. Yes, because once you know that, you can say, and you see it in the navigation manual, sometimes they say, all right, if you are in Yemen and you want to go to Gujarat in the north of India, sail northeast until your latitude is this many degrees, this many fingers, they would say, and then just sail straight east. Yeah, so you needed one way of picturing which direction you were going, yes, and you needed, very importantly, a way to determine how far north you were, yes. And for this, they used many combinations of the celestial bodies. So it's not just about what star is rising here. No, you could say, well, if one is there, you have to know which one is setting there and their relation. Yes, and you observe them one day, and then the next day you see when this one is here, what happened to the other one. So there's a whole complex that starts appearing in the mind of these navigators. And they use all that in a very sophisticated way. And still it is done like that in some smaller pockets, maybe. So here at this point, when Ibn Majid is mentioning this, he is speaking of what I mentioned earlier as the joining together, the articulation, the harmony as an art product. So this other level on which the pilots establish connections is within themselves. And in this we have again something they share with other traditional arts, because there is no such an art that is not also an art of self-realization and a delicate attunement between the microcosm and the macrocosm. Someone may argue, I have just taken one example out of a navigation book to develop my argument. Is this enough? Are there any others? Am I forcing my argument? No. There are a few more examples that indicate clearly the connections I have established here, and in some authors they may be missing, but the master-disciple transmission of their craft and their belonging to a traditional civilization ensured that the cosmological frame was there, giving sense to the external practices. So actually this is a third aspect where this art of navigation in the early modern Indian Ocean meets our definitions of traditional art. It's the manner of their transmission. Yes, and they made a lot of this. And you read sometimes the description saying, oh, you have to respect the person who taught you how to navigate this. And sometimes also there is the secrecy about the knowledge they had acquired. And even to our days, I was talking to a colleague who has had the opportunity, he lives in Abu Dhabi, to travel around mostly the Omani and Yemeni coast and talking to old sailors and so on. And he says one day he witnessed how some people of the Omani government, I think, came to this village because they knew there was an old pilot there who knew a lot. So they told him, the government people of the Ministry of Culture came and said, listen, we're here to record your teachings because it's so important, it will be lost. You have no disciples. No one has learned from you, and you haven't taught your son. And then it will disappear. And then the man didn't even answer. Just did it like, he preferred it to be lost than to have it recorded like that. You know, he needed a disciple brought up by him in a very traditional way to transmit his knowledge. Otherwise, he just thought, well, better let it disappear. I'm not saying I agree with that, but it's a very strong example of this attitude and of this idea of the lineage of transmission of a craft, right? So I have one question that I have left to answer, and I just have a provisional answer. I would like to maybe hear what you think. What is the product of the art of navigation? I mean, if a painter makes paintings or a baker makes bread, what is it a pilot makes? Very prosaically, we can say he makes the route, a path through the water, a waterway from point A to point B. Less prosaically, and because all arts illuminate each other in many ways, the art of the pilot tells us that the end products of our diverse artistic practices are in a way also paths, or should be. Every art under the stars, under the patronage of number, is also, or should be, or could be, a wayfinding and a path making. Thank you very much.